Hello, FNS 121. I'm here with your Chapter 1 review and your video lecture. I'm going to advise you to do a couple of things. Number one, if there's a PowerPoint presentation that's associated with Chapter 1, you might want to either print that out or have that handy. Number two, I believe there's some diagrams that have been posted on Blackboard. If you don't already have those printed out, print those out so that you can have those and you can follow along appropriately. I don't have the documents here, but I do know what the documents are, so I'll be able to help you with those diagrams. And also, the diagrams that you have, they are also in the textbook. They might not be 100% exactly like them, but they have the information up there that you will need to know. And then also, make sure you have your textbook handy because there's some information that I'm going to reference and advise you that you don't necessarily need to focus on that. And that's something else that you need to keep in mind for your Connect assignments. As you are doing your Connect assignments and you're doing the reading, there is some information that might appear in some of your assignments because I just can't filter all of it out. I try to filter out as much of it as I can. But as you are doing the Connect assignments, you will notice that there might be a question or two, and you might say to yourself, we didn't cover that either in video lecture or in class. You won't be responsible for that. And let me also advise you that with the Connect assignments, it's not necessarily checking to see that you're getting everything correct. It's trying to help you with focusing and studying the information as you read it. So the Connect assignments are really based upon completion. If you should get a question wrong, then it will advise you that it's wrong. It will also show you where you can go back in the text or in the ebook in order to locate the accurate information. So just keep that in mind. Don't negate the assignments. The assignments for the first half, those assignments that are due just prior to the midterm, they are worth 75 points, so each chapter is actually worth 15 points apiece. So make sure you take the time. It shouldn't take you any more than about 30 minutes of reading. You can always come back to it, but don't forget to come back to it because if you do not submit it by the due date, then you won't get all of the points. Okay, so having said that, you'll see me kind of look away periodically because my textbook is right beside me. I also have my makeshift whiteboard here at home. Here it is here. So I'll be using that, and I will be writing some information down and advising you what you need to do as well. If there are any interruptions, just bear with me and I'll get right back on track. All right, so first things first. We are studying human anatomy and physiology, but we're studying it from the standpoint of funeral service education. We are not trying to be doctors or nurses, however, we are practitioners, and we need to know just as much about the human anatomy as the nurses and the doctors and everyone else does. So even though we won't cover all of the information that's presented in the textbook, we will go over a pretty good amount of it, and anything that you don't need, obviously, I will tell you to delete. Now, a couple things as we start up Chapter 1. In Section 1.1, it's just a general introduction in regard to the human body, what anatomy is and physiology. But when we get to Section 1.2, it really focuses and hones in on what the difference between anatomy and physiology are. So you can read through all of that information. However, just to kind of shorten it a little bit, and hopefully it's not backwards. If it's backwards, then let me know when we get to class and I'll make sure I adjust it. Anatomy focuses on the various structures, and since we are focusing on the human body, we're talking about human anatomy. So we're looking at the structures from the cellular level all the way up to the organ systems and the actual human body in full itself. While we focus on the structures, we are also looking at the functions of the various structures that are part of the human anatomy. So Section 1.2 will really go into and read, you can read that information in there, but it really starts to come together when we get to Section 1.3 and we begin to talk about the various levels of organization. Because in this class, since we are focusing on human anatomy and physiology, there must be anatomy and physiology for other things. but we need to actually find out or determine, well, we know why we're focusing on human anatomy, but we need to determine what else is kind of on the same level or has the same characteristics as we do as being an organism. And that's where section 1.3 really takes shape, because 1.3 is beginning to talk about the various levels of organization. Now, in that section, it starts from the subatomic level. I'm not the chemistry teacher, chemistry has never been my forte. Biology is my thing. So we're not going to start at that subatomic and macro and micromolecule level. We're going to start at the basic unit of structure and function, and that is the cell. So for our levels of organization, the cell is the least complex of all of the levels of organization. But all living things are made up of cells. And as you see, I've indicated these are the levels, and the cell is the least complex level of organization. Well, cells that are similar in structure and function and work collaboratively together for the good of the organism, they will then form the next level of organization, which are tissues. We only have 4 tissue types in the body. That's it. We have hundreds and thousands of cells, but we only have 4 types of tissues. And we'll talk more about those when we get to the next chapter that we'll be focusing on. But I might as well go ahead and introduce them now. The 4 tissue types that we have are epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. That's it. Now we've got all kinds of cells. We've got muscle cells. We've got bone cells. We've got cartilage cells. We've got red blood cells. We've got white blood cells. Yeah, got thousands and thousands of those. But we only have 4 different tissue types inside of the body: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. Okay, so back to this, our levels of organization. Tissues will then work collaboratively together to form organs. Now, I just gave you examples of cells: red blood cells, white blood cells. The scientific names for those: red blood cells are erythrocytes, white blood cells are leukocytes. We actually have what are called platelets. They are cells too. They're called thrombocytes. In fact, any of you that might have either had medical terminology or are currently in medical terminology, the suffix cyte, site, means cell. So anytime you see that at the end of the word, it's referencing some type of a cell. We have muscle cells that are called myocytes. We have cartilage cells that are called chondrocytes. We've got bone cells that are called osteocytes. So we've got a lot of different types of cells. And these cells will then come together and work collaboratively to form the tissues. And then the tissues will come collaboratively together to form the next level of organization, which are organs. I think we can all identify at least one organ: heart, brain, lungs, liver, spleen, urinary bladder, stomach, colon. We all know pretty much examples of organs. And that's something that you will also need to know for your quiz. Know examples of cells, examples of the 4 tissue types that I identified, an example of an organ, and then finally, but then next, we have organ systems. Organ systems are those organs that work together to perform specific functions. So, for example, if I said nose, mouth, lungs, trachea, those are all organs that are a part of a larger organ system referred to as the respiratory system. If I said esophagus, liver, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, all of those organs work collaboratively together to be our digestive system. So the organs will then work together to form the organ systems. And then finally, all of the organ systems work collaboratively together and they make the organism, which is the most complex level of organization that we have. And we are the organism. But we're not the only ones. I mean, there are other things that are organisms. And as I said, all living things are made up of cells. And if you look around as you go outside and you go through your days, you'll notice there are a lot of things that are actually living. Plants are living. My dog over there asleep in the chair, she's living. We have some very, very small living microorganisms, the ones that we can't see without the aid of a microscope. But the thing about it is we are focusing on human anatomy and physiology and what makes me different as an organism from the organism that's in the chair, my dog. Well, what it is that we all belong to what are called kingdoms. There are only 5 kingdoms. But everything that's part of a kingdom is a living thing. And we'll identify the characteristics of living things in a minute. But the 5 kingdoms include the following: Animalia, which is animal. Plantae, which is the plant kingdom. Mushrooms fall under kingdom fungi. If you've ever had strep throat or staph infection or anything like that, they are actually living things. That's the bacteria kingdom, which is kingdom Monera. Oh, can't see that real good. And I'll present this to you in a moment. And then we have a kingdom that is composed of single-celled microorganisms, and that's called kingdom Protista. And single-cell microorganisms you might not know as much about, but examples would be a euglena, paramecium, and I think many of us have heard of an amoeba. They are one cell that have the ability to function as it was a multicellular organism. So here are the 5 kingdoms listed. Kingdom Animalia, or animal. That's where we would fall, and so does my dog Star. But when you get to microbiology, we'll see how there's differentiation in the various organisms that fall under kingdom Animalia, because we fall in that kingdom. Star, who's a dog, falls in that kingdom. A great white shark would fall into that kingdom. A panther, a black panther. So when you get to microbiology, we'll talk about that a little bit more. Plant kingdom. I think I can all identify a plant or two. Kingdom fungi. Kingdom Monera, which are the bacteria. And kingdom Protista, which are the single-cell microorganisms. So you might say to yourself, okay, well, fine. That's great. There are 5 kingdoms. Anything that is living falls into a kingdom. That's absolutely correct. So if we were to think about it, what kingdom would viruses fall under? It's not a trick question, so I'm just going to go ahead and give you the answer. Viruses do not fall into a kingdom because viruses are not living. Viruses require a host cell in order to replicate. So literally, they have to find a living thing, then literally inject the genetic information that they have inside of them into the cell, and then what actually encapsulates that genetic information literally kind of just sloughs off, and then the cell does the work of the replication. So viruses do not fall into a kingdom because they are not considered living things, because they must have a host cell to live. So if you're saying, all right, well, that's all fine and well too, I can grasp that, not an issue. What makes something living? And this is important for us because we need to make sure that our cases that we are working on do not exhibit any of these characteristics at all. Because if they exhibit some of the characteristics of living things, guess what? They're not dead. They're still alive. So, characteristics of living things. If you are looking in your textbook, characteristics of living things falls under section 1.4. And section 1.5 we're going to skip, so I'm just want to go ahead and tell you that now. Because maintenance of life, our people aren't living anymore. They're not maintaining life. but we can talk about the characteristics of living things so we can make sure that our cases that we are working on are not actually exhibiting any of these characteristics. First things first. Living things can move. Now, I know everybody has said, well, I have heard that dead people can move. No, dead people do not move. What can be perceived as movement is muscle relaxation. And that is this. Upon death, there is complete muscular relaxation. So if for whatever reason, when I passed away, my arm was folded, was bent, this muscle, the bicep, is contracted. But upon death, muscle relaxation occurs, and that limb or that arm would potentially look like or give the appearance of moving. But the deceased person is not performing that action. That is happening as a result of complete muscle relaxation because of the cessation of life. So they don't move. They don't move. They don't sit up. They don't do any of that. The next thing, living things have the ability to grow. Think about it. We move when we're born. We eventually begin to grow. And then as we continue to grow and mature, we also have the ability to reproduce. Reproduction is the third characteristic of living things. Living things can reproduce. Bacteria can reproduce. If you have been introduced to enough of them, if they continue to reproduce, they can make you very sick. Some bacteria can reproduce in abundance and so much that they can kill you. Next. Responsiveness. Living things have the ability to respond to a stimulus. A stimulus is something that would evoke some type of action from whatever it's acting upon. For example, let's see, I'm in my house, so I can't do anything right now. Let's use Kingdom Plante this time because I haven't used the plant kingdom yet. If I have a plant that I sit directly in front of an open windowsill that gets sunshine every day, that plant is going to grow upright and it's going to grow right toward that light. However, if I take that same plant and move it away from the light source, the plant needs the light in order to help it grow. But since it's been removed from the stimulus, being the light source or the sun, the plant will then grow in the direction of where the light source is. So it's responding to the fact that it has been moved away from the light source. So that's an example of responsiveness. On the top of page 13, you will notice that there's table 1.1. Table 1.1 also identifies certain characteristics of life, such as digestion, respiration, absorption, circulation, assimilation, and excretion. All of those are certain chemical activities that living things have the ability to do. So instead of trying to remember all of those, the fifth characteristic of living things that we are going to know for our assessment purposes will be that living things have the ability to perform certain chemical activities. And those are our characteristics of living things. So, if our cases are exhibiting any of these characteristics, that's an indication that they're not dead. Okay, so you will continue reading section 1.5. But then as it goes into, no, you don't read section 1.5. You read all of section 1.4, skip over section 1.5, and you will go directly to section 1.6. 1.6 is beginning to talk about the organization of the human body. When we get to the skeletal system, we'll talk about this information even more, because it advises that our bodies are actually divided into two different divisions. And there are very different bones that are located in each division. That's why we talk about it more in the skeletal system. But we have the axial division, and we have the appendicular. The axial division consists of the head, neck, and torso, or trunk. Sometimes that's used as well. Axial, head, neck, and torso. While the appendicular division consists of the upper and lower extremities, meaning our arms and legs. Because we can actually exist as just, and we can continue to live as a head, neck, and torso, the axial division is also referred to as the body proper. Obviously, we can't live as just upper and lower extremities. But the body proper is what has body cavities in it that house our vital organs. At this point, if you don't have the diagram with you that says body cavities that you can access on Blackboard, you might want to take that out. If not, you can look at it on the PowerPoint presentation, and there, as you click down a few slides, you will notice that it has a slide that says the axial and appendicular skeleton, and it outlines in different colors. One is in yellow, one is in purple, as far as what is considered the axial division and what is the appendicular division. I'm going to show it to you in the textbook, or if you have your textbook, which you should. If you look on page 18, and this is what I want you to make sure that you are looking at. This diagram right here. Because it's showing us the body cavities in which you can find the internal organs. Now, the view at the top is giving us what's referred to, what we might say is the side view. But there's some anatomical terminology that we really need to know after we finish this chapter, because we're not going to refer to it as looking at someone from the side view or looking at them from the front. We have scientific anatomical terminology that we're going to use. So just for 1 second, if you would turn to the back of the chapter in section Section 1.7 has anatomical terminology. And the ones that you need to make sure that you know are as follows. You need to know number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. You can skip 7, 8, and 9, but you do need to know 10 and 11. And these are directional terms to help us understand what position a portion of the anatomy or portion or structure is located in relationship to another. So typically what you'll find is you'll have one word, and then the next word just under it means the opposite. So for example, superior means toward the head. Inferior means toward the foot. Okay. Medial means toward the midline. Lateral means away from the midline. Anterior means toward the front. Posterior means toward the back. And then we got all of those, 1 through 6. If you look at 10 and 11, distal and proximal. I will explain those a bit, because with distal and proximal, you have to have a point of reference. So distal sounds like distant to me. So if something is distal, it's further away from the point of reference. It's more distant. If it's proximal, it means the opposite. It's closer to the point of reference. So if the point of reference is my shoulder, what would be the most distal anatomical structure? Would it be my elbow or would it be my wrist? Well, here's the point of reference. Here's my elbow. Here's my wrist. So then therefore, the anatomical structure that is most distal would be my wrist because it's further away from the point of reference. And then it would be just the opposite if I asked the opposite question. Which structure is most proximal to the point of reference? The reference point being my shoulder. And I ask the elbow or my wrist. Well, the elbow is closer to the point of reference. So just remember with those two, you do have to have a point of reference. In addition to that, and I like to introduce these terms now, but we'll talk about them a little bit more when we get to the muscular system. We have what's called rotation. And the reason why we study them in the muscular system is because we need the muscle action in order to help us to perform that activity. And in addition to that, it also helps with joint movement. But rotation and circumduction. Rotation means to turn on an axis. If you think about it, the earth rotates. This is rotation right here. I am rotating. In fact, let me turn it so you can see it. It's rotating on a fixed point. That's what the earth does, and it takes how many hours for the earth to rotate on its axis? 24 hours. Okay? Well, let me put that down. Rotation to turn on an axis. However, circumduction is to move in a circular path around a fixed point. Circumduction, to move in a circular path around a fixed point. I'm going to use our solar system again. Okay, we've already indicated that the Earth rotates on its axis. However, the Earth, while rotating on its axis, circumducts the Sun. The Sun being the fixed point, and the Earth moves in a circular path. Okay, move my arm. Circular path around that fixed point. And it takes the Earth 365 days to circumduct the Sun. Rotation, turning on an axis. Circumduction, to move in a circular path around a fixed point. Okay, so now we have some of that anatomical terminology, but there's another word in there that we need to know, and that's anatomical position. Anatomical position is what our cases should always be in. We should always be thinking anatomically. So literally, when I started the video, I tried to make sure that what you were looking at was what you could understand because of the writing. Because if I had just had the video normally, the wording that you would see would be backwards because we are mirror images, literally. So that means my right hand, if you were looking at me, would correspond to your left hand. Okay? So anatomical position, we always have to think of our cases. We are always thinking anatomically. And anatomical position is standing erect, head is faced forward, palms up, feet are placed forward. If the palms are down when we're standing and everything is by our sides, I'm just not standing up right now. If the palms are face down, that's not anatomical position because palms are supine, meaning palms up. Okay, so remember that, because if you're looking at a diagram, or if you're looking at a piece of paper, or you're looking at a case on a sheet of paper, then what you may think is their right, because this is your right hand, anatomically, it's the case's left hand, the mirror image. All right, so we've already taken care of that, but now we can go back to our diagram on page 18. On page 18, the diagram at the top is the lateral view where we can identify the various body cavities. On your diagram, I believe it's a reversed view, but it's the same view nonetheless. We have a couple of other words up there that kind of mean the same as anterior and posterior. Ventral and dorsal. Ventral means cavities that you can see from the anterior view or from the front. And dorsal means those cavities that are along the back. Well, a very easy way to remember this is if you think about the word dorsal, whenever I hear it, I think about a dorsal fin on a dolphin or a shark, or does a shark have a dorsal fin? Yeah, a dorsal fin on a dolphin. Let's say a dolphin. That's the easy one to use. So dorsal would be on the back or toward the back, and ventral would be toward the front. So those cavities that you can see that are dorsal cavities would be the cranial cavity and the spinal or vertebral cavity. These cavities obviously have, number one, the cranial cavity encases the brain to protect it, while the ventral or the vertebral or the spinal cavity has the spine on the inside. I would suggest at this point that you are labeling the diagram as we're going through. If you're not labeling the diagram that is on Blackboard, then you can definitely reference the diagram that's in the textbook because the information is the same. And then if we look at the anterior view, we can see the lateral view and the ventral cavity. One thing I do want to do, and I will show you what I'm going to do in the textbook because I want you to know how to bracket it as well, is that the ventral cavity, it's a little shiny. Okay, there we go. Okay. Hopefully you can see that. You will notice the dorsal cavity, it identifies the cranial cavity as well as the spinal or the vertebral cavity. But then when you look at the ventral cavity, everything that you see here, everything is part of the ventral cavity. So the most superior portion from the lateral view of the ventral cavity is the thoracic cavity. And it looks like from the lateral view, there's only one organ that would be there, but we'd have to wait to look at it from the anterior view to reveal everything else. And then we have what's called the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a muscular structure that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. And you will notice that the abdominal pelvic cavity is composed of two other cavities. The most superior region of the abdominal pelvic cavity is the abdominal cavity, thus the name. And the most inferior region of the abdominal pelvic cavity is the pelvic cavity. Now, unlike the diaphragm that separates the thoracic from the abdominal pelvic, there is no division or no divider or no clear delineation between the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. The only way that you know the difference is by the organs that are present. In the PowerPoint presentation, it identifies the organs that are present in each cavity, or at least a few of them. But pretty much for the pelvic cavity, you will find the reproductive organs and the urinary bladder. You would not find the spleen in the pelvic cavity. You wouldn't find the pancreas or the kidneys in the pelvic cavity, but you would find those organs in the abdominal pelvic cavity, because abdominal pelvic is literally referencing everything that is in the abdominal as well as the pelvic cavity, thus the name. But if you were given a multiple choice question, because your quiz is based upon multiple choice questions and identification of the diagrams that you have, and the question was, which of the following organs would be found in the pelvic cavity? Spleen, stomach, urinary bladder, colon. Let me not use colon. Let me use spleen, stomach, pancreas. The answer would be urinary bladder, because all of the other ones are found in the abdominal cavity, but only the urinary bladder can be found in the pelvic. But if you had another question that said, which of the following would be found in the abdominal cavity, or the abdominal pelvic cavity? Urinary bladder, spleen, small intestine, more than one of these. The answer would be more than one of these, because the question was, which of the following organs would be found in the abdominal pelvic cavity? Well, all of them are, because the word abdominal pelvic was used as opposed to just pelvic. So when you take your quiz, make sure you read the questions very carefully so that you select the correct answer. Okay, so now let's look at the diagram from the anterior view. And from the anterior view, it reveals a lot more. We can still see the cranial cavity. We can still see the spinal or vertebral cavity that's part of the dorsal cavity. But the ventral cavity, which is composed of the abdominal pelvic and the pelvic cavity, reveals a whole lot more, as well as it reveals everything in the thoracic cavity. So if you're looking at this diagram of the anterior view, everything that you see here can be bracketed. I don't know if you can see that. It can be bracketed, all of these, the left pleural cavity, the mediastinum, the thoracic cavity, right pleural cavity, pericardial cavity, abdominal pelvic cavity. All of those are part of the ventral cavity, because those are the cavities that you can actually see from the anterior view. The only two cavities we see from the dorsal view are cranial and spinal or vertebral. And then from the anterior view, we reveal everything else. But let's go up to that thoracic cavity. Because the thoracic cavity, when we looked at it from the lateral view, it only looked like one organ could fit. But we know that there are a lot more organs in the thoracic cavity. So looking at it, you will note that we have what's called a left pleural cavity. Anytime you see the word pleural, it's referring to the lungs. So you notice in looking at it in the textbook, it says left pleural cavity, but it looks like it's on your right. Correct? But remember, we have to always think anatomically. So that would be the left pleural cavity that's on the deceased, or that's on our diagram, because we always think anatomically. So we've got two lungs, so we'll have a left pleural cavity and we will have a right pleural cavity. In between the two, we have the cavity that the heart rests in, and it's called pericardial cavity. Medical terminology again can help. IAL means pertaining to, peri means around, and card, the root word, means heart. So pertaining to, around the heart, is the pericardial cavity, and that's where the heart actually rests. Now you also know that it's a dotted line actually. If you look in your textbook, it looks like a black dotted line that's kind of outlining the pericardial cavity in another region. This is not a cavity. This is a region that's located in between the lungs. It's called the mediastinum. In the mediastinum, yes, we will see the pericardial cavity, but we'll also be able to identify different organs such as the trachea is found in the mediastinum, the esophagus. The trachea is also known as our windpipe. The esophagus is also known as the food tube. That's the muscular organ that actually leads from your throat all the way down to your stomach. They can all be found in that region. So the mediastinum is not a cavity, but it is the region that's located in between the two pleural cavities that have the lungs. Okay, so now that we know the cavities that are part of both the dorsal and the ventral cavities that we can see from the dorsal and the ventral cavities, we need to know a little bit about the membranes, and this is in the PowerPoint presentation. And if you flip back to page, flip back to page 17, you can actually see this in the section that says thoracic and abdominal membranes. Because our organs are soft tissue, they have to be protected, and they're protected by what are called serous membranes. Now, there are membranes that will line the cavities that the organs are in, and then there are also membranes that will cover the organs. Anytime we have a membrane that's covering an organ, it's referred to as a visceral membrane. So if it's covering the spleen, if it's covering the stomach, if it's covering the heart, it's a visceral membrane. If it is a membrane that lines the cavity that the organ is in, then it's referred to as a parietal membrane. Very important concept to make sure that you have very clear. Visceral membranes cover organs. Parietal membranes line cavities. Once you get that clear, you're good to go. Now these membranes, they're kind of like saran wrap, just, so to speak. I mean, they're not actually saran wrap, they're membranes. But if you can think about how much friction there can be with saran wrap, I can't stand trying to use it because every time I try to tear it out of the roll, if it gets caught on a piece of it, it gets stuck and it's hard to pull apart. Well, that's because there's nothing, and that's how these membranes are as well. If there was nothing in between the membranes to kind of act as a lubricant, then that's the same concept that would happen with these membranes. So, in order to reduce the friction between the visceral membranes covering the organs and the parietal membranes lining the cavity, we have what's called serous fluid. And the serous fluid is designed to help to reduce the friction between the membranes. So, having said that, now that we know that there are different cavities, such as the pericardial cavity that's surrounding the heart, the pleural cavities that are surrounding the lungs, and then we also have what's referred to as the peritoneal cavity. The peritoneal cavity is not part of the thoracic cavity. It's actually the cavity where the abdominal pelvic regions are. The peritoneal cavity is unique, and I'll tell you why in just a little bit. But first, let's go back to the thoracic cavity and talk about these membranes that cover the lungs. A few minutes ago, you heard me say that anything that's referred to as pleural is referring to the lungs. So since we have that as a reference point, the membrane that covers the lungs is called visceral pleura. Visceral is covering an organ. So it's literally hugging it like some saran wrap. Like if you had one piece of fried chicken left or baked chicken left and you want to put it in the refrigerator, you didn't have any foil or anything like that, you could put it in saran wrap and it would hold right onto it. But the membrane that's lining the cavity that has the lung in it is called parietal pleura, because parietal is telling you I'm lining a cavity. Pleura says I'm lining the cavity that has the lungs in it. Okay? So then let's think about what the name of the membrane would be that's actually covering the heart. We already said that that's the pericardial cavity. The name of the membrane that actually covers the heart is visceral pericardium. Visceral covers organs. So then that membrane that is lining the cavity that has the heart in it, parietal pericardium. Parietal lines the cavity. So those are the ones that have individual names, because there's only one organ that is located in each one of those cavities. But let's now go to the abdominal pelvic cavity. Well, whole lot of organs in there. And it's referred to as the peritoneal cavity. Well, each organ that is present in the abdominal pelvic cavity has its own visceral membrane. And that visceral membrane, for whatever organ is being covered, whether it's the kidneys, or if it's the ovaries, or if it's the urinary bladder, they all have the same visceral name, and that's visceral peritoneum. They all have an individual membrane that covers that particular organ. But what I could do, and what the medical examiner does when they do an autopsy, is that they eviscerate the abdominal pelvic cavity, thoracic cavity, and sometimes the cranial cavity too. Evisceration means just to remove all of the organs that are present. So if I was to go into the abdominal pelvic cavity and remove all of the organs, I would have a very hollow cavity that's lined with a serous membrane that's called parietal peritoneum. Because there are so many organs present that there's not an individual name for each one. So that's why it's called visceral peritoneum. Lost my train of thought. Visceral peritoneum that covers each one of the organs in the abdominal pelvic cavity. And it's called parietal peritoneum that lines the cavity that has all of the organs in the abdominal pelvic cavity in it. And of course, in all of these cavities, the thoracic cavity, the pericardial cavity, it's that serous fluid. Well, the pericardial cavity, the pleural cavity, and the peritoneal cavity. The serous fluid keeps all of the friction reduced in those cavities. Very important concept to understand. But if you can keep it clear that visceral is covering an organ, parietal is lining a cavity, you'll have no trouble at all. All right, so we can move beyond that. The rest of section 1.6, you can skip over because we're actually going to study each of the individual organ systems, so we don't need to do that. And we focused already on section 1.7, which is about anatomical position and anatomical terminology. And if you look at on page 24, the part of section 1.7 that we did not get to was the body sectioning and body planes. So let's first look. Oh, there were two other terms of anatomical terminology that we need to know. It's going to be very important for the vascular system. I didn't even see them on page 24. But numbers 12 and 13, superficial and deep, are just like what they sound. Deep, oftentimes I will ask, what does deep mean? And somebody will say, deep means deep. Well, yeah, but you can't use the word to define the word. Deep means further away from the surface. And superficial means closer to the surface. Important concept for the vascular system because arteries are deep to veins. So when I make an incision and I'm looking for a vessel, oftentimes I will encounter the vein first because the artery will be deep to the vein. Okay, so make sure you include those in the terminology that you know. Well, if you look at the diagram, this at the top of page 24, it's identifying, sorry, a little bit of noise. It's identifying the different body planes or ways the body can be sectioned. And I'm going to put a couple of words up here because it's got some terms like parasagittal that we don't use, but I want to make sure you have the accurate terminology. Okay, we have these terms. Mid-sagittal, sagittal, horizontal, also referred to as transverse, coronal, also called frontal, and then we also have oblique. Looks backwards to me. It's right for you. Okay, so as far as the sectioning, as these different types of sectional planes, mid-sagittal will section the body into an equal right and left portion, or equal right and left division. So mid-sagittal means equal right and left. So on the diagrams on Blackboard, make sure you find the letter that is identifying the plane that divides the body into an equal right and left section. Because sagittal, as you can see, is a portion of the word mid-sagittal, but it's not an equal sectioning. A sagittal plane will divide the body into a right and left section. So if there was a plane, for example, mid-sagittal would divide me directly down the middle. However, a sagittal plane would divide me into a right and left section, not necessarily an equal section because I don't have mid in front of it. So sagittal, right and left sectioning. Horizontal or transverse will divide the body or section the body into a superior and an inferior region. Or again. That's my alarm system. Okay, thank you. The coronal or frontal body sectioning plan will divide the body into an anterior and a posterior region. So that sectioning would be this way down the side. Good girl. Thank you. Okay, it's a little mad. And then finally we have the oblique plane, which is a diagonal plane of sectioning. Okay, the last thing that we need to cover are the body regions. And if you would turn with me to page 26, at the top of page 26, we can actually see the division on an abdomen of a person. The one on the, well, let's just say letter B. Letter B is the easier of the two. It's called the 4-quadrant plan. It literally looks like a 4-square, if you've ever played 4-square before. And basically what you would see on the abdomen, and these are imaginary lines. Of course, you wouldn't be drawing anything like that. But you always think anatomically, and you have an upper quadrant, you have lower quadrants, and then you have the right side and you have the left side. So the right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, left lower quadrant. That's easy enough. However, for what it is that we need to do, sometimes we need to be a little bit more specific. And the 9-region body plan is what kind of helps us a little bit more. And when you look at the diagrams, you can actually see how it segments or gives you an idea of where the underlying organs lie based upon that 9-region body plan. And ideally, what we see, or imagine that we see, something that looks kind of like a tic-tac-toe board on the abdomen of the deceased. Now, what's really important is that we don't mix up the right and the left side. That anatomical position comes in all the time. So, looking at this would be the right side, and this would be left. And we have some words. We have right hypochondriac, right lateral, but where it says right lateral, what you can learn that, but that's also referenced as the lumbar region. So here in the superior regions of our tic-tac-toe board, we have the hypochondriac. It's all one word, but I couldn't get it all in the square. Then the next region down, while it refers to as the lateral region in the text, it's also referenced as the lumbar region. And then the most inferior region is referred to as the inguinal or iliac. This will make more sense when we actually get to the vascular system. And since we're talking about a right and a left body region plan, whatever is over here is going to be the same thing over here, but it's just going to be on the left side. Now, you might be trying to figure out, say, okay, there are a couple of ways that you can remember these. Lumbar. If you've ever gotten a pedicure and you sit in that big spa chair and they turn on the chair and there's a little button that you push that says lumbar. Typically, it hits you right in that region. So the lumbar region is the middle region of the 9-region body plan. Now, just superior to it is what's referred to as hypochondriac. A couple of things. Use that medical terminology if you don't know what it means. IAC, pertaining to. Hypo, below. Hypodermic needles, right? A hypodermic needle goes below the surface. So sometimes let the prefixes tell you what they mean, or think about another word that might have in it. It can help you. And chondro. Now that one you might not know, but it means cartilage. So that word is literally telling you pertaining to below cartilage. Well, if you look at the diagram, the hypochondriac region is kind of just below and also encompasses part of the ribs. Well, the ribs have to have cartilage in them, right? Well, the bone itself doesn't have cartilage, but there's cartilage that attaches it to the sternum, which is the breastbone, because it allows for the expansion or the inflation and the deflation of our lungs. So that's telling you that region is located below cartilage, hypochondriac. And then the inguinal and iliac regions, like I said, we'll talk about those more when we get to the vascular system, and that'll make a lot more sense to you. But that area is where the groin is. So whatever you have on the right side, you're going to have the same thing on the left side. And then in the middle, we have those that are a little bit easier to remember. Okay, the umbilical region. I don't know what to tell you if you can't remember that one. But the umbilical region is where the navel is. And then you have two other words, which would be hypogastric, hypogastric and epigastric. We just said hypo means below. Gastric means stomach. IC, once again, pertaining to below the stomach. The hypogastric region is this region here. This is where you'll find the urinary bladder, some of the reproductive organs. The epigastric region, epi meaning above, like the epicenter of an earthquake, is that place on the surface of the earth that is where the earthquake began. Well, we know that the earthquake actually begins inside of the earth, but the epicenter is that location on the surface. So epi means above. So epigastric is telling you pertaining to above the stomach. And this would be the epigastric region, the umbilical region, and the hypogastric region. The reason why we take the time to know this information is because after we embalm our cases, there's a process that we do that's called aspiration. I didn't have an opportunity to tell you, I don't believe, that the process that we do, formaldehyde is a gas. It's not a liquid. And it's in an aqueous solution of formalin. However, what we do, or our embalming process, requires us to raise an artery and a vein. We raise an artery and we inject our arterial fluid, thus the name arterial fluid, into the artery. And we incise that artery, inject a tube, fluid flows in. But because our vascular system is a closed system, it literally pushes the blood through the vascular system, and then we will also have a vein raised that we have incised that has either spring forceps or a drain tube in it to allow the blood to escape. So over a period of time, as you are embalming your case, you should note that your drainage that you get begins to at least take on some of the coloration of the fluid that you're injecting. That's giving you a better indication and idea of how much of the blood volume you've actually been able to get out of the system. We're not going to be able to get it all, but we try to get as much out as we can. Once we have completed the embalming process, then we have to undergo a process that's called aspiration. Aspiration is when we take what's called a trocar. And a trocar looks like a very long tube with a point at the end that has little holes at the end of it. We attach a rubber tube to the other end of it, and then that rubber tube goes down into the slop sink that is attached to what's referred to as an aspirator. The aspirator has a stopcock on it that if you turn it in one direction, water can flow through it, but if you turn it in another direction or the opposite direction, it has suction. So after we have finished our embalming process, we need to turn it in the manner so that we will have suction. And we will introduce that trocar kind of using that 9-region body plan as our guide to give us an indication as to where to introduce our trocar. Now, ideally, what we are trying to do, the heart being in the thoracic cavity, bear with me. It's the best I can do. We are trying to pierce the right atrium of the heart because at any given point, the right atrium of the heart has the greatest amount of blood volume in it because the two largest veins in the body will take all of the blood from the head and the neck and the lower extremities and dump it into the right atrium of the heart. And we know that blood has blood-borne pathogens in it. That's why we're trying to get as much of it out as we can. So veins, so you know, take blood back to the heart. Arteries take it away from the heart. So with all this blood sitting right in there in the right atrium of the heart, once I have finished my embalming process, some of it may still pool in the right atrium. That's why I will then introduce my trocar based upon what I can imagine that I see on the abdomen of the deceased. And I will insert it typically in the epigastric or the upper regions of the umbilical region because it's long. However, I don't want to introduce it way down here because it might not be long enough to pierce the right atrium. But if I'm somewhere in this region, that's not quite the region I wanted it to be. Hold on. Somewhere in this region, along this kind of a line, if I pierce that right atrium of the heart and I have the aspirator on, I should be able to see over a period of time blood come out and actually pool inside. Now, hopefully it's not pooling. You want it to drain inside of the slop sink. So, why do we need that 9-region body plan? You might try to figure out why in the world are we even talking about this. For this reason right here. So we can pierce that right atrium of the heart. We can get an idea of where I need to introduce my trocar in order to accurately pierce it. Now, what you also see is that you have to kind of navigate through some other organs as well and get beneath that rib cage. So you might not always get it the first time, but the idea is to try to make sure that you do eventually pierce it so we can aspirate as much of the blood out of that chamber as possible. Well, have I talked you to death? That takes us through chapter 1, however. If you have any questions about anything, then please make sure that you contact me. You can contact me via email, kijones@tcc.edu, if you have questions before that you would like to have answered as soon as possible. Typically, I can answer, as I believe I said in the introductory video of the syllabus, that I try to make sure I answer within 24 to 48 hours. However, if it's on a weekend or if you email late at night, it might take just a little bit longer, but I will get back to you. So, chapter 1 complete. I hope you have a great day or great evening, and I will see you soon.